All right. How you doing, everyone? Okay, let's see here. So I have again, just so y'all know, I have the camera on top of the computer today and chat below it. So if you see me looking down, it means I'm reading your chats. Wanted to start. We got a few questions left over from last week. I'll be getting to that. Yes, yes, sorry. I always see you all in here talking, wonder where I'm at. Every Sunday, we start the same time as usual, just 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. So don't worry, someone didn't disappear me or anything. Everything's good. All right. So as always, you folks have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. We have a few from last week as well, so I'll be working on getting through all those. So first off, this is from Chris Coe. Says, "Hi Josh, hope you are well. I am submitting my question in advance of the live Q&A due to time difference in Europe. You previously mentioned that you don't vote, but given the current social situation, this is from last week, but given the current social situation within the US and the growing threat from the CCP, do you think you will cast your vote this year? It's clear there's a lot at stake in this election this year. Would love to hear your views on it. Thanks for your great work as always, Chris." So I've mentioned before that I don't personally vote. Um, I think people should vote. I think it's important to vote. I hope you all vote. Personally, I don't. I'm not locked into it. It's not an absolute. I haven't voted for quite a good while actually, and it's more just my understanding of what it is to be a journalist. I think journalists should try to. How should I say it? I think journalists should try to stay out of having direct interest in the electoral process to an extent. But yeah, what do we see here? Thank you, NKSB. I don't know. I've gone back and forth with it. I mean, on one side, yes, I do see a lot of issues on the horizon, and they concern me pretty deeply, to be honest. At the same time, I feel like as a journalist, people are trusting me to try to look at information as, as unbiased as possible. And I've been wondering how to do that responsibly. What is the responsible thing to do? One, when I do see some pretty serious things. For me, always the biggest issue has been the Chinese Communist Party, honestly, because I've been following threats from the CCP for a long time. We can talk about short-term back and forth, red-blue conflicts in the U.S., but the long-term threat is the Chinese Communist Party. And for a long time, personally, I didn't think any politician could deal with it. I do think Trump has done an incredible job dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, to be honest. I also see a broader trajectory right now taking place in the world where it seems a lot of people are waking up to it. A lot of countries seem to be waking up to it. So, yeah, voting pollutes the mind of a journalist. Well, here's where I'm at again with voting. I'll be honest. I mean, I've gone back and forth. I'm wondering what is the correct approach to this. I've reflected on it, and again, I feel like people are kind of trusting me to look at information and to not take a personal, emotional, or biased stance on it. I think people are trusting me to look at information as non-biased as possible and tell them as non-biased in the most non-biased way possible what's actually going on. What are the policies of Biden and Trump? And actually, this week I'm going to be doing an in-depth analysis on Trump's policies and Biden's policies. I feel like people are trusting me with that, and so to better serve that, I haven't voted. But again, this isn't to say I think people shouldn't vote. I think people should vote, absolutely. And I mean, I'm pretty upfront too with what my stances are. I'm very against socialism. I'm very against the Chinese Communist Party. It's fair to say that. I believe it's a totalitarian regime that has killed around 100 million people, depending on how you count it. 50 million to 70 million just under the Chinese Communist Party. I think really, I would say the accurate view of the Chinese Communist Party is to regard it as a totalitarian, murderous regime. I think socialism, communism are, destructive, murderous systems, no different from fascism. I think it's a moral stance opposing them, not so much a political stance. That said, I also look at, I also look at the global trajectory. I actually do think socialism, communism, I think they're on their way out, to be honest. I know people would say otherwise because we're looking at mass protests on the streets. We're looking at a lot of noise from these organizations. We're looking at what seems to be people attempting another communist revolution, in their own words, some of them. If you were to look at what, for example, some groups within Democratic Socialists of America, Freedom Road Socialists are talking about, and the different trajectories we see really with Biden's policies. A lot of his policies are very socialist. Um, but again, I see also a real break taking place in terms of the grassroots of this country, in terms of people like you and me, and in terms of the elite of this country, the journalists, well, most journalists, the academics, the main institutions, ironically, big corporations, big business leaders, a lot of politicians. I wouldn't say most, but a lot of politicians. There's a lot pushing for socialism right now. I do think this is an issue, and part of me feels like in the upcoming elections, maybe I should vote because honestly, I do see a trend in socialism, and I feel like I should do something about that. But again, I've gone back and forth, with it, and I've decided I'm not going to be voting this year again, just because again I'm reporting on. Yeah, I do believe everyone should vote. Again, I've gone back and forth with how we should deal with it, but again, part of my job this year is I'm trying to cover both sides. I'm trying to cover policies on Democrats and Republicans. And I feel like if I vote, it's giving myself kind of a position, and I don't want to do that. And so maybe next time, we'll have to see. Moving on to some other questions. This is from Lisa Taylor. Do you think the United States will bring all their manufacturing back home? So, interesting question. Let's look at some of what's happening in the world right now. So remember that ahead of the pandemic, before this whole COVID-19 CCP virus thing started, and I agree with you folks. Yeah, I'm reading some of your comments. Josh, that's terrible. Vote at least for those who gave their lives for our freedom. Yeah, okay, going back to, I've gone back and forth with it. Yeah, not voting Josh, you cheapen some hard-won rights. Yeah, I know, I do agree. It's a value. I've been going back and forth with it. I understand what folks are saying. Maybe I will vote. I don't know. It's been a standard I've had for a long time where I'm trying to be nonpartisan. But I've been wondering how to deal with it, to be honest. Just being honest with you folks. Got my kombucha again. Y'all crack me up. All right, let's move on. So Lisa Taylor said, "Do you think the United States will likely will bring all their manufacturing back home?" I think there's a few different elements to it. When it comes to manufacturing, remember what was happening before the pandemic hit. There was the whole trade war with China and the United States. Trump was pushing very hard on really putting tariffs on the CCP, pushing back very hard on some of their, I'd say, unfair trade deals. It actually looked for a while like Trump was actually going to make a trade deal with China. He wasn't as hard on them as he is now. It looked for a while like the US and China were going to have a trade deal. And really, that was the trajectory before this whole, COVID-19 CCP virus thing hit off. It did seem like that was what was going to happen, that they were going to have this agreement on it. What happened? The Chinese Communist Party, of course, covered up this virus. It spread throughout the world and really angered the United States. And as the US criticized China for its actions during that time, the CCP really took some pretty hard actions to attack the United States. Yeah. Sorry, folks, just reading. Anyways, yeah, so the Chinese Communist Party was pushing back. It was pushing back against some of the criticism on it. And the Trump administration really at that time, I think, started to realize the Chinese Communist Party was a lot more hostile to the US than it had originally thought. Sorry, folks. I see you're all still in the voting thing. Maybe I should stick on this a little bit. 1 sec. I'll read some of your questions. John, you are obliged to vote this time, so your principles have to sit aside. Yeah, you're probably right. Resistance fighter, out of all the elections, this is the one you're not voting in. Are you joking? This is the most important election since Abraham Lincoln. Don't vote for something, vote against the Democrats, the CCP. Yeah. I've also been following what's happening with Hunter Biden as well. And it does actually seem that they're planning to release the stories tying him to the Chinese Communist Party, which I've been seeing as well. It is getting pretty serious, I think, in that regard. A few other questions here. Yeah, Zach Briggs, vote, but don't tell your viewers you voted. Don't want to get shadow banned or be a victim of cancel culture. Yeah, well, that's the other issue. I mean, the amount of censorship we have on the internet with these platforms right now is ridiculous. You almost can't take you almost can't take a political stance these days unless you're like really far left without getting attacked. And so it is a bit complicated like that as well. It's hard to even talk about these things. All right. Anyways, folks, yeah, stop J-Dog, stop communism. Josh, yeah, I know what you all mean. Maybe I'll change my stance on this. Fair enough. All right. Yeah, you're all pretty good on this. All right. Anyways, let's move on. Or we're going to be talking about this all night. All right. Anyways, so what happened again? We were talking about bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Remember what happened? It actually looked like before this whole virus became a pandemic, before it spread from China to the rest of the world, it looked like the U.S., it looked like the Trump administration was actually going to make a new trade deal with China. Remember that before the whole CCP virus thing took off, before this whole thing took off, what was happening? The Trump administration was actually looking to renegotiate the trade deal with China. Basically, he was saying we're losing out on our trade deals with China. We're not getting anything out of it. He was renegotiating, putting pressure on them and trying to bring them to the negotiating table. I personally think the Trump administration, that they did not think the CCP was as bad as some people were saying. Of course, I've always had a pretty strong stance on it. A lot of people wouldn't, before this whole virus took off, a lot of people would think that my pretty hard stance on the CCP was a bit too much. They might say that, oh, well, that's your position. You guys are pretty critical of China in general. Maybe it's somewhere in between that's the true position. I think after the CCP virus took off and people saw, first off, how the Chinese Communist Party lied to the world about it, how they cornered the market on PPE, personal protective equipment, how they lied through the WHO and then began attacking different countries if they dared call out the Chinese Communist Party. If Australia called for investigations into the CCP, they attacked them, verbally at least. If the US, like Pompeo, for example, criticized the Chinese Communist Party, they lashed out at him. I think what happened, not just with the US, but a lot of parts of the world, a lot of countries saw that the Chinese Communist Party was a hostile state. And the Chinese Communist Party seemed to have thought it had more influence than it actually does. I really think the CCP overplayed its hand. They thought they had more influence through trade and through political interests than they actually did. And because they took such a strong stance attacking different politicians around the world, it really pushed a lot of countries away. I think the Trump administration saw that. And so it went from being renegotiate trade deals with China, make a new trade deal with China, to basically decouple with China altogether. It seems the current trajectory of the United States is to break away from China altogether. Of course, all this was leading up to 2020. I think the Trump administration was anticipating, maybe they had a lighter view on China before this. I think they were anticipating that really they could negotiate a new trade deal with China. And that would be a pretty solid way to solidify things going forward. That it was bad deals in the past, fine. Let's fix those deals. Let's move forward. I think during this pandemic, everyone saw a very different face of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think now the general assessment is because of national security, you have to pull your companies out of China. The Chinese Communist Party, you might have seen right now, is even threatening tit-for-tat retaliation because the U.S. arrested several Chinese individuals, Chinese nationals. Sorry, someone's asking, does Epoch Times talk to China and censored? Yeah, I'm in very good terms with Chris Chappell, actually. He and I hang out sometimes. Anyways, getting back to it. You might remember, so, following the virus outbreak, basically, it seems the trajectory now is breaking away from the CCP altogether. Sorry, people are asking, aren't China Uncensored and Epoch Times both part of NTD? NTD is under Epoch Media Group. Epoch Times and NTD are both Epoch Media Group. We're the same parent company. And yeah, China Uncensored is under Epoch Media Group. All right, so back to the point. And my point is, I think the Trump administration policy on China changed because of the CCP virus, I think after the CCP virus, Trump administration in many countries in the world, even including Angela Merkel, even including different countries, Australia, Japan, India, they've seen a very different face of the Chinese Communist Party. The trajectory now is basically breaking away from the CCP altogether. And again, as I was saying too, the Chinese Communist Party right now, as we speak, is threatening to arrest US citizens in China. They're threatening tit-for-tat retaliation, just like they did with Huawei in Canada. You know, Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, this giant Chinese telecommunications company. And what happens? The CCP arrests two Canadian nationals and charges them with espionage, and then says, you let go of Meng Wanzhou, we'll let go of these two individuals who are facing the death penalty in China right now. The CCP is threatening that right now on US citizens in China. And so the CCP, it's overplaying its hand. It's pushing too hard, and it's making countries realize that it's not safe to have our own people in China. The CCP can arrest them anytime. It can trump up charges anytime. It can nationalize companies like it did, for example, with the mask manufacturers, American company in China manufacturing masks. The CCP nationalized it and forbade it from selling to its own home country, the United States, during the height of a pandemic. And so, again, it's complicated stuff. I think the trajectory moving forward is, in fact, decoupling from China, and I think the trajectory of that is moving a lot of U.S. manufacturing back to the United States. But I also think we're going to see the rise of India, and we're actually probably going to see a lot of manufacturing move to Mexico, as well as maybe Vietnam and a few other countries as well. But really, the CCP is going to be losing high-tech industry because they've lost their chips. We're going to see the impact of that, I'd say, within the next 6 months. And I think also the Chinese Communist Party is no longer going to be the manufacturing hub of the world. It loses those two things. What does it have left? It's going to be interesting to watch going forward. All right, next one, Cesar Caioli. How can we demolish the communist ideologies? I mean, it's not easy, because I think when a lot of people talk about communism or socialism, they tend to only talk about it from within the boundaries of economics. I've talked about this quite a bit, so I don't want to go over it all again. Communism is not just about economy. Communism technically is an ontological theory. It's a metaphysical theory. It's an understanding of what is the nature of life and what is the story of human existence. That is what it is. It's closer to a religion than it is a political system or an economic system. And really, if we were to get into that, I mean, that's I could do a whole episode just talking about that. I always want to give book recommendations. Y'all want to read a good book on this? Actually, the Epoch Times did a big series on this. Yeah, more. It is like a cult. Actually, it's actually accurate. One sec. All right. Epoch Times did this series. The Spectre of Communism is Ruling Our World. Highly recommended. It talks about the ontological nature of communism, what it is and how it manifests in every part of, really pretty much every part of our society has some degree of influence from it at this point. Keep in mind, communism was spreading even prior to Marx. It existed even at the time of Marx. He did not coin it. He did not come up with it. You could say that he kind of perfected it and allowed it to spread, but he didn't come up with it. Communism pre-existed him. And really, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, communism and socialism were used mostly interchangeably. It was understood that Marx believed in the 5 stages of civilization: the agrarian society, or primitive communism, we would call it, the feudalist society, the capitalist society, the socialist society, the dictatorship of the proletariat, where basically you have a totalitarian government controlling everything. And then communism that exists through the negation of systems, even with the collapse of the socialist system. And again, socialism was seen as, when we think about it, socialism, you could say, is the system of communism. The goal of communism, the envisioned utopia, comes about through the collapse of the socialist system. But applied communism, if you apply its ideologies, is socialism. Communism, the goal it would aim to achieve would be, once these things have all collapsed, pretty much, the negation of systems, right? The negation of the negation, as they would call it. If we get into different ideas within Hegelian dialectics and such. All right. Anyways, I could do a whole episode. I could do several episodes on that, actually, if you want to get into the real details of communism. Actually, a few of you have asked about China Uncensored and Chris Chappell. I did, I think, 2 episodes with him on the history of communism, which you can watch or listen to. It was on the China Unscripted podcast. If you all want to jump on it, after this episode, please. But you can check out China Unscripted and listen to the whole episode I did. It was like 2 hours long. It was really long, going into the history of communism and ideology. Cal-Hence Johns. Josh, what are people saying that Joe Biden would be swayed to be anti-CCP, and that Trump doesn't attack the CCP with a plan, but only makes noises? Right. So, this was one of the talking points that Kamala Harris brought up during the debates with Trump. And the Democrats are really sending mixed messages right now on China with Biden. The Democrats themselves released their own plan on competing with China, which includes pretty much Green New Deal infrastructure policies, which Biden's pushing for. But in terms of not being swayed by anti-CCP, so on, remember that Biden, important things to note, during the Obama presidency, Joe Biden was let me step back. During the Obama presidency, Obama's policy with China actually changed. He had the Asia pivot. You might remember, it was the time when China was pushing into the East China Sea and the South China Sea. The Obama administration launched the Asia pivot, where they moved a lot of the U.S. naval forces to the Asia Pacific region. A lot of that was to push back against the CCP's, hostile takeover of the South China Sea, when they started building these artificial islands. We were doing what we call freedom of navigation exercises, where they were sailing through that area because the Chinese Communist Party put an ADIZ in place, basically a no-go zone where you had to ask permission to travel through the area. They believed the CCP was doing what they call an A2AD strategy, area denial tactics, where they're not allowing other countries into that area while they basically build things up militarily and establish a defensive ring. Now, I know this sounds all complicated military jargon. Basically what it means, the CCP was, building artificial islands, putting weapons structures on them. I really appreciate the donations, folks. Also, sorry I can't talk about it individually, but I don't want to keep stopping at the same time. Basically, what that means is the Chinese Communist Party was building these artificial islands. It was putting defensive or offensive structures on them, like missile defense systems, and was using that to extend the defensive ring of the Chinese mainland into the East China Sea and South China Sea, in order to deny access of that region, into that region, by the United States. The belief was, for example, the CCP, by using that strategy, could create a defensive ring around that region, which would prevent, for example, the United States intervening if the Chinese Communist Party wanted to make like a hostile takeover of Taiwan or something like that. Basically to, extend the arms of the CCP to, push back or hold back possible adversaries. That was the idea of it. During that time, it was actually Joe Biden, who was vice president, who was assigned by the Obama administration to go and negotiate with China. And what happened? Well, he brought Hunter Biden with him, and Hunter Biden left with like billions of dollars, or more than $1 billion worth of deals. It's hard to say whether that aligned with the Obama policy at that time, or if that was Hunter Biden making his own deals, or whether Biden was directly involved in that. But it was pretty shady, to be honest. I mean, there's no, I think there's an idea of partisanship where you You try to stay out of it, but you got to be honest sometimes too. It was pretty shady. And the Clinton administration at the same time was making deals like that as well. There was uranium one. There were all these different policies she had, really using Bill Clinton at that time to, through the Clinton Foundation, go on these whole speaking tours and getting money while she was using policy on her end, doing what appeared to be things that aligned very closely with the speaking tours he was doing. Clinton Cash, there's a book and also a film about it, details a lot of this. And so it seems that Biden, at least on the surface structure, was doing things very similar to this. And of course, a lot of the information coming out now on Hunter Biden does suggest this. I think we'll have to see what comes out on it. That said, based on Biden's policy with the CCP, his stance is basically, Biden himself was less direct on it. Kamala Harris was more direct. And she basically accused the Trump administration of ruining things with China. And her stance was that Trump's strong stance, she said, it had failed. I strongly disagree with that. I think it's been really effective. And I also think it's not just the US now, it's even a lot of pretty far left countries, even like the EU and Germany, which are pretty progressive, by their standards, are pushing back against the CCP in very similar ways. I think the Trump administration policy is becoming the global standard with dealing with China. It's not just a Republican Democrat thing. It's not even just a right-left thing anymore. Let's put it that way. But Kamala Harris's stance was that this has failed, and she was saying that, being strong on China doesn't work, really, is what she was saying. And so based on that, it does seem that the Biden policy, if Kamala Harris, if her statement on it is accurate, and going by the way that Biden handled the Chinese Communist Party previously, it does seem to be that they would take a lighter stance on it. As far as Trump's attacks on the CCP and what he's doing, honestly, I've said it before. Going back on previous administrations, it was not a partisan issue. Bush, Obama, Clinton, Nixon, they all tried different approaches with the Chinese Communist Party, and every one of them failed. Not only did they fail, but they actually gave the CCP the ability to become what it's become, really using the corrupt financial institutions of the world to achieve it. And the Chinese Communist Party we're facing right now is the Frankenstein of Bush policy, of Obama policy, of Clinton policy, and going back even of Nixon policy. It was a Democrat and Republican issue. Based on the trajectory of where this was heading, watching all the different threats I've been watching, United Front, economic theft, you name it, I didn't think it could be addressed. I did not think anybody could come in and fix it. I thought it was at that level. At the same time, I knew that there was internal instability in China, and based on that, I didn't think the CCP was as strong as it claims to be because of internal instability and infighting within the party. But in terms of foreign pressure, I didn't think a lot of this stuff could be cleared up. Trump's policies are working, and I can just say that pretty directly. His policies in China are working, and they're being replicated now again by countries that don't align with this whole right-left thing. Again, Germany, Australia, both pretty far left, technically, countries. A lot of socialist policies. They're having very similar stances on the Chinese Communist Party right now. And so I don't know on what grounds they're saying that Trump's policies aren't working. I think if they're saying that, they haven't been paying attention. All right, a few other ones. Move on. Got my kombucha again. All right, one sec here. There's a question on India I wanted to get to. I had it on the one sec. So this is from last week. I wanted to get to because I think it's an important question. It's from KS. How do you see India's standing against China? Seems they have been the most potent military threat to China so far. Should US/Japan/Australia/Russia come out and support India fight China? Actually, this is a big one. I really think India could become really what the Chinese Communist Party was expected to become in terms of becoming a global superpower. And, people joke about this, but really in terms of technological capabilities, education, emphasis, how many Indian doctors do you know? I mean, In terms of emphasis on education, in terms of technological capability, in terms of manufacturing capability, in terms of price of manufacturing, India has all the pieces in place to replace what China was for the world. I really think India is going to become what China was, but without the hostile communist system in power. I really think we're going to see a huge rise in India. Um, I think that's going to be one of the big shifts we're going to see. And even now with the Quad Alliance, we see an alliance with India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. Now, India is an interesting country. Going back to the Cold War, they were on friendly terms with the Soviet Union. They were on friendly terms with Russia. They also didn't take a hostile stance towards the U.S. They're kind of like the Switzerland of the Asia region. You know, they never really took a hard political stance, and I think because of that. Oh wow, thanks. I really appreciate the donation, everyone. Anyways, I think because they haven't taken a really strong political stance, they're on neutral ground with a lot of countries. Of course, the CCP views them as their biggest competitor, and so the CCP, through its own sphere of influence, has pushed back against India, like we see with, for example, Sri Lanka, and we see, for example, with Pakistan. But really, with India right now working with Japan even doing some high-tech manufacturing in India, different countries looking for a new replacement for Chinese manufacturing and keeping it really within the same region. India is the closest, best option in a lot of regards. And again, they also have the high-tech manufacturing capabilities, I think at least on par with where China's at, even though they don't get the credit for it. Really, I think we're going to see India really come up on the world stage. And on top of that, too, India could become a major diplomatic player. They haven't really gotten involved with this. I think because India, they don't have the same ambitions of the CCP. They don't want, I don't think India wants to become like the global hegemon. I don't think they care about that. I don't think they have that kind of ambition, that they're happy being where they're at. You know, there are a lot of countries like this, actually. And I think that once they get that manufacturing capability and they become more active on the world stage, not because they want to become global hegemons like the CCP does, but because they just see themselves as having an important role to play on the global stage, really India could have a lot of influence in the entire Asia region. India could become the regional leader of the Asia region. Between them and Japan, if they could make a strong enough alliance. This is going to be big, I think. And also, if India takes a stronger stance in building up its military with U.S. support, and with between Japan again and Australia, with U.S. support to build up its military, India could become a big player. And on top of that, too, India has friendly relations with Russia. And like, I know there's all this, Russia stuff going on. Really, I think if Russia had the option to break away from the CCP, they'd take it. They don't really get along with them. They fought wars against China. Even during the Cold War, they were fighting wars with China. Remember the Amur Valley conflict. A few questions. M23G, appreciate it. Thank you. And PB, thank you as well. Sorry, I'll try to get to all the questions. Anyways, that's what I see happening. I really think we're going to see a strong rise of India, strong rise of Indian manufacturing, and also a rise of India as a military power, very likely even a regional peacekeeping power through this new Quad alliance, as well as actually, I think, a diplomatic power. I think that's on the horizon, very close with India. All right, next questions we have. Let's see here. So let's move on to some for tonight. This is from Linda Manning. Who would take over the CCP if she was unable to do it? Is there a standard policy in that case? One sec. Again, got my homemade kombucha, folks. Just a touch of honey, it's perfect. All right. Okay, so again, from Linda Manning, who would take over the CCP if she was unable to do it? Is there a standard policy in that case? You folks don't like kombucha? All right, fine. Okay, I'll go on a small tangent. Kombucha is very easy to make. I think it translates to the tea of immortality or something like that. Cha being the Chinese word for tea. Basically, you want to make it, it's easy to do. Go on Amazon or another website, buy a SCOBY, SCOBI, It comes with a bit of liquid actually in it. The liquid is like kind of fermented, liquid, and it's your starter. Just like if you were to make yeast for sourdough, it's just like a starter. All you do is just brew a big thing of tea like you normally would, black tea or green tea, I'd recommend, and put enough sugar into it as you would normally, as to what you would normally drink. Don't do any more than that, or it's going to get very acidic. And just brew a big thing of it. I do it like once every couple weeks. I got kombucha on tap. It's wonderful. I love it. All right. Anyways, with that kombucha tangent out of the way, let's move on. All right. And don't overheat it too. You'll kill the mushroom. Just heat it like you could put your hand in at warm temperature. All right, let's move on. Just because a few of you have asked about it before. All right, Linda Manning, who would take over the CCP? If she were to step down or be taken down, very likely you would see a factional battle to take over it. Were she to be taken down right at this moment, very likely you'd see the Jiang faction, former Communist Party leader Jiang's been trying to take over it. You could also see the head, for example, of the state council trying to take over it. It would be no different, really, were it she or another party leader in place. The issue is not she. The issue is the Chinese Communist Party. It's the CCP as a whole, which is why you'll find, of course, I talk about Xi policy, but when I talk about the problems with China, I say the Chinese Communist Party. I don't talk about, Winnie the Pooh or something like that. I talk about the Chinese Communist Party because that's where the problem's coming from. All right, let's move on. From T last name, we'll be discussing the latest on Hunter Biden hard drive info. Yes, and I'll be working on getting some updates on that as well on the main channel. Those of you interested in this, actually, you might have seen I did a pretty in-depth episode on this already. I spoke with M.A. Taylor, who did the film Riding the Dragon, which is a documentary about Hunter Biden and all these different exploits he was going on. You can check out the episode on this channel. I did a whole thing on it. We interviewed the director, and so curious about that, check it out. I'll also be covering things as they go forward. Roy Ronquillo. What will we get out of socialism? Socialism, right? The big topic in the world right now. Okay, so there are different interpretations of socialism. There are different degrees of socialism. A lot of people talk about democratic socialism. Democratic meaning democratically elected as opposed to hostile takeover through violent revolution. And a lot of people, when they talk about socialism, they're not talking about full socialism. They're talking about, say, economic socialism. What socialism does is, well, yeah, I could get into all kinds of things on it. I don't want to do a whole episode just on this. But what socialism does, what a lot of people would think of it, really, when it comes to the economic policies, it does not build people up. It does not take the poor of a country and try to uplift them. It takes the people who are well off and it tears them down. It is not a building up, it is a tearing down. It's not about building up the poor, it's about tearing down the rich and even the middle class in a lot of cases. And the big question to ask too is why do all the big billionaires, all the big hedge fund owners, all the big money, big centralized banks, why do they all support socialism? If it's against the millionaires and the billionaires, why are they supporting socialism? I think the big answer here is because they know that if they were to get socialism, it wouldn't impact them. It would impact the people in the middle. They would get subsidized funds from the state. They would become state-owned or state, influenced companies, just like they have in China, where they're eating out of an iron rice bowl, so to speak, like different business leaders in China. They know that it eliminates any possibility of competition from the grassroots. And what you have is state-subsidized failure, essentially. Within a free market economy, you have a feedback system. You have the feedback system where companies are allowed to fail. The same thing we saw with the socialized banks, if we're going to go back in history with it. One of the reasons why a lot of us are stuck in these dang debt traps. One of the reasons why we have this fiat currency. If we go back into it, what happened? Remember that prior to the Federal Reserve, the establishment of the Federal Reserve, prior to all of that, banks were able to fail. If a bank gave, predatory lending, if it gave away too much money and it defaulted and people, for example, wanted their money back from the bank because they take the money and they, invest it and so on, what happens? They find that the bank doesn't have their money. The bank gives out what it has left and it collapses. It goes out of business. That ability to collapse, if you're not doing things, let's say in a fair or rational or responsible manner, the ability to fail if what you're doing is bad business existed within most systems. When they created the centralized bank, the state-run version of the bank, and later the Federal Reserve, which is not really federal or a reserve, that basically created a system of taxpayer funded through inflation bailing out of the banks, meaning banks can basically make bad loans. They don't care if you ever pay them back. They can create new currency through the loan process, and they can control inflation. Really, a lot of people getting these bad loans for colleges. Why is it that you can never pay them back? They don't need you to pay them back because they're federal loans. They're not the bank, the schools. I mean, I'm going on a bit of a tangent explaining this principle here, but the federal loans to these schools, they don't care if you never pay them back. The schools themselves have no interest in you paying them back. They can charge as much as they can possibly charge because they do not care if you can pay it back. Why is that? Because they're not responsible for the money. They have no interest in whether you can succeed in life. And so what happens with socialism? You subsidize this type of behavior. You subsidize this overcharging of people using taxpayer-funded systems rather than resolving the problem at its root. Rather than resolving the reason why the costs are so high, you're subsidizing that corruption and those high costs. Ludwig von Mises talked about this quite a bit. Appreciate the donation. Thank you. I'll try to get some of these questions. I don't want to break away from this. But Ludwig von Mises talked about this quite a bit when you're, for example, dealing with the normal feedback systems within societies. He talked about, for example, not just socialism as we know it, but also National Socialism or Nazism. He talked, for example, about the same problems existing within the fascist system, which were socialist, different interpretations within it. You could say that people these days believe in different versions of it, but it was still socialism. And the idea is you're having the government subsidize different parts of the economy. You're having government subsidize different parts. But when they subsidize it, it means a few things. It means that a failing industry cannot collapse. And it also means that say, alternatives to that cannot compete. When you have that, what do you have? You have products that people don't need getting subsidized without a feedback system. Because the feedback system is people themselves using their dollar, using their money to basically do purchases and buying things. And what they don't need fails. If they don't need it, it fails. And if you eliminate that system of feedback, if you have the state subsidized system of it, you have subsidized failure. You have a zombie failed system continuing to operate that tears down any person who reaches any level of success, tears them down, and subsidizes what is essentially state slavery, where individuals are basically just living under the coin of whatever communist or socialist regime you're under. I think it's a terrible system in every regard. And I think we've seen the cost of it over and over and over again. And yes, you could say that some people don't want full socialism. You could even argue that the Nordic model is less socialist than what we have in the United States. They don't even have in some of these countries, for example, minimum wage laws. It's socialism in different regards, but it exists in every country to an extent. And it's always a progressive, you could call it, or downward trajectory where it's marching forward along deeper and deeper state takeover of systems. That is the progressive nature of it. The progress along the social evolution, as Marx would talk about it, towards full communism. That is the trajectory of these things. I think it's a terrible, failed system. It's a murderous slave system that is the worst possible thing that could happen to humanity. That's my stance on it. To get out of it, well, I think crony capitalism, state-run banks, debt economies, I think these are just as bad. And if you go back into the history of these things, if you go back into what these things were, centralized banking, right? Marx himself talked about it. that the crony capitalism, as we call it, is based in socialism. It's one thing, for example, that Ludwig von Mises talked about in his book Socialism. A lot of people who criticize the capitalist system were actually criticizing the interventionist policies that were brought into these Western systems through socialist policy. A lot of these things, a lot of the problems people observe, even a lot of things that a lot of the left right now complains about, were brought into our system through interventionist policies that were rooted in socialist ideas. The problem is, again, it's just too much. People criticize different parts of the same thing. It's the elephant in the room where people are talking about a different piece of it without realizing the whole picture they're looking at. And so again, yes, cost of school is too high. That's a problem. That's because of the interventionist policies of the federal loan system. Yes, we can't afford houses. Yes, they're too expensive. That's because of the Federal Reserve and centralized banking systems, which are brought in by socialist policies. Yes, I agree that I disagree with a lot of the corporate models, but guess what? Under LBJ, under the corporate reforms, we brought in socialist policies into the corporate system. We're dealing with different parts of socialism that people don't like, calling for socialism without realizing what they're criticizing is, again, things brought about by interventionist policies rooted in the very thing they think they believe in. And so it's complicated. A. Dalo, I appreciate the donation. Thank you. Yeah, so again, upcoming 2020 elections. Actually, on election night, I'm going to be doing a live. We're planning on it. We'll see. Should work out. We're planning doing a live. I'll be probably broadcasting for like 6 or 7 hours. If you want to hang out with me all night on election night, we're going to be doing a long broadcast, I think, on NTD. So stick around for that. I'll keep you all updated. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. They actually asked me to do it. They're like, Josh, you can talk, about any, nonsense for, forever. So how about you join up? So yeah. Anyways, you can hear me going on tangents for 7 hours. It'll be fun. All right. Just keep moving on. I'm never gonna get through all the questions. All right, moving on. Yeah, Nicola, the corporate system creates structures and influence that mimic communism. Yeah, again, I agree. This is one of the areas where I think conservatives and liberals and conservatives, need to start seeing eye to eye. The corporate system has a lot of communist elements built into it. If you go back into history, again, on the corporate reforms, under LBJ especially, but even prior to that, even going back to like the 1930s, there were a lot of things brought into the corporate system that came from socialism. And it's true, the corporate system does mimic a lot of communist elements, including like syndicalism, even within the unions, because a lot of these policies were actually implemented into it. Yeah, so it's complicated. One of the reasons why Henry Ford supported fascism, which is, again, a type of socialism, one of the reasons he supported it was because it mimicked what the corporate system was practicing at that time. It mimicked the industrial system that he wanted. Again, I fully agree. I think crony capitalism and corporatism are terrible. I think if we were to get rid of socialism fully, we need to address all these elements. But it's a problem because people tend to talk over each other. People tend to talk over each other when they're dealing with these topics. They again think of socialism just as a economic policy. They think of it like free healthcare and free schooling, and they don't really think of it beyond that. They don't realize that there are elements of it going back very far, implemented in a lot of parts of our system that people don't like on either side of the aisle. It's complicated stuff. I think it needs to be addressed. All right, Chul the World. Why is big tech supporting socialism? Same reason I just mentioned. What's going to happen? You're going to have state subsidized systems, pretty much. If we had full socialism, what happens? Socialism doesn't get rid of big business. Socialism doesn't get rid of the billionaires and the millionaires. It doesn't get rid of the factories. It doesn't get rid of environmental pollution. It doesn't get rid of any of these things. Can we name a single socialist country that has gotten rid of big business? No. All it is taking away these things from individuals like you and me and putting it under state ownership, meaning you have a state-owned, basically hierarchy of party leaders, government leaders, and business leaders assigned sometimes by the government who run these things. They call it, giving it back to the people, but who really benefits from it? Name one socialist or communist system that's gotten rid of private enterprise, or big factories for that matter. Soviets had it. You could even argue that Pol Pot had it under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia through these state-subsidized farming systems, the killing fields. They don't get rid of these things. All right, moving on. James Crimson. You've mentioned the persecution of Falun Gong many times. Can you please tell us why the spiritual discipline is so important to many Chinese Americans? Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand Falun Gong. I've mentioned before I practice Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa. A lot of people say, oh, Isn't Epoch Time is funded by Falun Gong and all this stuff. No, it's not funded by Falun Gong. I think people misunderstand. I mean, it was started by Falun Gong practitioners, yes. You can read our About Us page. It's not a conspiracy, even though people try to make it into a conspiracy. I think a lot of people, how should I say, I think a lot of people criticize these things because they don't understand it. They don't know what Falun Gong is. And I think if they understood what Falun Gong was, it wouldn't be controversial. Basically, what's the story of it? Well, what is Falun Gong first off, or also known as Falun Dafa? I think the problem we have in the US when it comes to understanding Falun Gong is people don't understand the traditional religious systems of China. There's the main religions. There's Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism in China. And these would be the main religions. Under Buddhism or Taoism, if you say you practice religion, it means you go and shave your head and become a monk if you're a Buddhist, or grow out your beard and your hair and become a Taoist priest. Saying you're part of a religion means initiation rites, going to a temple, all kinds of things. There are lay Buddhists and lay Taoists who practice casually. But they also in China have a spiritual culture, the idea of refining your character, the idea of, for example, trying to become a better person, the idea of character refinement. They believe still in heaven. They believe still in reincarnation, like all the other Chinese religions. And they believe in the basis of, right and wrong, good and evil, and making an effort to become better people by refining themselves in accordance with, they would believe, the wisdom of God or the wisdom of heaven, trying to become better people and refining their own characters. Tai Chi was based in this tradition. You might have seen, for example, Chinese people doing the slow movements in the parks. Some of the old martial arts systems were based in this tradition. They had what's called Qi Gong in China, which is Qi being like earthly energy, Gong being a higher energy theory, like a divine energy theory. It was very popular in China. It's kind of like Chinese yoga. You see Chinese people in the parks doing it in the mornings. If you go out at like 6 a.m., you can see people doing it in the parks. That's Qigong. Falun Gong was the most popular Qigong practice in China, basically bringing back the old religious traditions of China, the idea of character refinement, of trying to become a better person. In China, it wouldn't actually be classified as a religion. In the West, because we have, I think, stronger definitions of religion, it's considered a religion in the West. But in China, it wouldn't be considered a religion. It's more like a Tai Chi or like a yoga or like a practice of refining your character. Long story short, what happened? Falun Gong is based now. What happened in China with the Qigong movement? Basically, it became very popular in China. Everybody was doing Qigong in China in the early 90s. It was super popular. Just like the martial arts craze in the US in the 70s, that was Qigong in China. It was huge. 70s, 80s, 90s, right? Basically, what happened was people started charging money for it. People started making up their own systems. And the older traditions started getting lost. What it was started getting lost. And so 1992, Li Hongzhi, the founder of Falun Gong or Falun Dafa, came out and made his system public, because a lot of these have been passed down generation through generation, going back very far in ancient Chinese history. Yeah, it's more like a philosophy. That's accurate. Or kind of like Stoicism. If you understand the history of Stoicism, like Marcus Aurelius, it's maybe a good comparison. Falun Gong was made public in 1992. It was an older tradition as well, and quickly became the most popular Qigong practice in China because it was always taught for free. If you learned it, you could teach it under the condition that you don't charge money for it. All the teachings were free. You can download them online. There's no churches, no temples or anything like that. You just go in the park, practice. There's exercises, meditation, and there's a character refinement. The idea of practicing Zhen, Shan, Ren. Zhen being truthfulness, being a true person, being honest. Shan being kindness or compassion. And Ren being the ability to endure, to not be moved by things, to have a light heart that can't be shaken easily, to take things lightly. And so people were practicing in accordance with these values of being honest, being kind, being tolerant, not being moved by things, and just keeping it real, maybe a way to put it. And the idea is, through the traditional Chinese standards of traditional practice, they believe that, the religious element of this, they believe that by improving yourself, by becoming a better person, you can assimilate to the standards of heaven. That you need to reach a moral level to, reach that level. Now, that's the idea in traditional Chinese culture. What happened in China was the CCP saw it become popular. Close to 70 to 100 million people estimated in China by 1999 were practicing it. That's more people than the Chinese Communist Party has of members. The CCP then decided, it's a threat. They declared it was a threat to the communist ideology of the CCP, this idea of class struggle, of, fight against heaven, struggle against the earth. The ideas of communist atheism, they saw it as a threat to their power, and so they set out to eliminate it. They did different reviews. They said, prove it's a cult, find something bad about it. They couldn't find anything. Finally, at the time, the Communist Party leader at the time, Jiang Zemin, said, persecuted anyway. So they launched a large disinformation campaign, imprisonment, torture, re-education through labor, you name it. 100 million people persecuted. Think about that, 100 million people persecuted for trying to be good people. And what happened? Because they didn't have a reason to persecute it, they fabricated reasons. They spread all kinds of disinformation, and Western media repeated that disinformation. Western media lied on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. That's what happened. And so, actually, that's part. I appreciate it. Aid Delio. I know you guys had a good elevation. I appreciate it. Oh, sorry, I read that already. Anyways, the Chinese Communist Party said persecuted anyway. Western media repeated these lies, and they still repeat these lies. While people are literally being killed for their organs in China, while Falun Gong is known to be the largest persecuted group in China, where the largest population in these re-education through labor camps is known to be Falun Gong practitioners, the world and a lot of the media are totally silent on it. How is it that 100 million people are being persecuted? Most of you probably never even heard about it. I think that's a real serious thing to consider. Wise and Frosty, I appreciate it. Thank you. And so this is also why Epoch Times was started. It wasn't a Falun Gong funded thing. Falun Gong doesn't have money. It's not like a institution. People don't understand this. It's individuals who practice Falun Gong, basically doing things on their own free volition. Any less than a company started by Christians is, Christian funded or whatever. It's no different than that. Anyways, long story short, you're asking, why is it so important to the Chinese people? It's 100 million people persecuted. Think about how many of them have family members, how many of them have kids, how many of them have grandparents. If about 1 out of every 15 Chinese people is being persecuted right now as we speak, this is a persecution that affected the entire country. This is a persecution that every single person in China has been impacted by, and the world is silent on it. Really, I think that once the truth on this finally comes out, when the world finally sees what's been happening in China, because we've been exposing a lot of it at Epoch Times, including, for example, breaking the story on live organ harvesting. When the truth about this comes out, people are going to be horrified, I think. The stories I've heard personally from people who've escaped from China, the stories I've heard personally of people who've been tortured, I mean, it's like Holocaust level stuff. When the world sees what has happened in China, and meanwhile turning a blind eye to it, meanwhile Western businesses pouring money into China, meanwhile Western media lying on the CCP's behalf, spreading propaganda and disinformation on their behalf. Really, I think it's going to shock the world when the truth comes out. But again, getting back to it, I think that so when I talk about the persecution of Falun Gong, it's one of the biggest persecutions in China. That's the reason I talk about it every now and then. It's important to note. Probably one of the biggest human rights abuses in the world right now as we speak is the persecution of Falun Gong, and it gets almost no coverage. Anyways, so someone's asking on the topic of Falun Gong, what about the Dragon Springs compound? Yeah, people, like, again, Western media have tried to paint all these different conspiracies about it. Dragon Springs is called the Falun Gong compound. Look, it's a dance school. It's a Shenyun dance school. People make a big deal about it. Yeah, people try to make all these conspiracies. It's just like it's a standard of morals you hold yourself to, essentially. All right, moving on. Paradise Pilgrim. The Epoch Times is a far-right international multi-language newspaper and media company affiliated with the Falun Gong new religious movement based in the United States. Wikipedia. Yeah, keyword there, Wikipedia. So if you read actually, what are they basing the far-right stance on? There's a group that does these analysis on different media. I think there's one called All Sides. Initially, they had actually branded Epoch Times as being far-right, and they recently reevaluated that, and they placed Epoch Times as centrist to center-right. It's already 10:30, so I'll be ending soon. They replaced it as center to center-right. The fact they tried calling Epoch Times far-right is ridiculous. There's nothing far-right about us. If they're trying to say it's like ethnocentrist or ethno-nationalist, we never push any of those ideas. In most of our reporting, we're actually pretty balanced. And what happened was All Sides did a reanalysis of it just recently because a lot of people were pushing back saying Epoch Times is not far-right. They did a reevaluation of it, and they found it's in fact not. It was a blind evaluation, meaning that they let people read it without telling them what media it's from. And they said, actually, the reporting is very balanced. It shows both sides of arguments, and it's pretty direct. They put us as center to center-right. The only reason they said center-right rather than absolute centrist is because the people we interview do tend to be more conservative-leaning. And so Epoch Times is not far-right. It's called that only by people who... let's put it this way. Before Trump, people said we were center left. Think about it. That was at a time before all this, that, let's say, socialism was not as in vogue as it is now. I think people are just so black or white, one extreme or the other, that if you don't fully align with their political views, that they brand you as being the most extreme of the opposite of it. I don't think it's a fair assessment. Again, Epoch Times is now designated as centrist to center-right. We're not far-right by any means. And I think if you read that for yourself, assess it for yourself, you'll find that as well. And how are we affiliated with Falun Gong? The people who started it were Falun Gong practitioners. A lot of the early staff were. It's not the case these days. But like myself, I've been there since 2006. A lot of the early staff were Falun Gong practitioners. And again, it was more because of a human rights stance at that time, because the media around the world was repeating CCP propaganda, lying about the persecution. And Epoch Times was the only media really telling the truth about what's happening in China. You can look at some of the stories we've broken. We were the first media to report on live organ harvesting. We were the first ones to blow the whistle on the Confucius Institutes. We were the first ones to talk about the SARS cover-up, the first ones even on the latest CCP virus cover-up. We were blowing the whistle on these things. We've been on the front lines of exposing the United Front. Going back to 2008, a lot of my work was on that. Things that we've exposed, we don't get credit for having exposed them a lot of times. But people see after many years that what we were saying was right. Unfortunately, we don't always get credit for it because maybe people don't remember. But really, a lot of things people are talking about with China, Epoch Times is telling you was happening years before people were talking about it. A lot of what people are seeing now, we were telling you guys years ago. And of course, now we don't just write about China. We write about a lot of things. I encourage you all to check out Epoch Times. I think you'll like it. If you think we're far right, tell me after you actually read it yourself. I think you'll find it's actually pretty balanced. All right, folks, that said, it's already 11:34, so I've been talking over an hour. And again, every Sunday I'll be doing these lives 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. I see y'all jump in sometimes a bit early and wonder where I'm at. 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. So yeah, it's all good. And again, we'll be doing the normal broadcasts at 10:30 p.m. Eastern time, again, Monday through Friday. And 1 second. I always get my throat gets a bit dry as I talk too much. All right. Anyways, you're all great. I always enjoy talking with you. I always apologize too. I can't always get to all your questions, and I feel bad sometimes, especially. I know you folks. I really appreciate the donations as well. It really helps us. And we get censored a lot. Let's just be honest. Green tea, no, drinking some kombucha. Those of you coming in late. We get censored quite a bit, and so we do appreciate the support, of course. Well, as anyways, folks, broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and again, we have some good coverage coming up. I'm going to be doing a lot more interviews going forward. I think keeping maybe about half to a third of the show focused on interviews, and I'm going to work on getting bigger names for you folks and ones I think you'll enjoy more. I know a lot of you like it when I just talk, but I think to get some of the bigger breaking stories, this will be better in the long run. I think it'll be the better trajectory for the show. And who knows, maybe one day I'll try to do longer shows too. I would like to personally, but we'll have to see. Anyways, folks, again, appreciate you all. Always enjoy talking with you. That said, of course, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, stay free. Thank you.